Good afternoon and welcome to Chisenhale Gallery. Thank you all for joining us for today's conversation between Lawrence Abu Hamdan and Stuart Comer. My name is Ellen Grieg. I'm the Curator of Commissions here at the Gallery, and it's my pleasure to welcome you both here today. Thank you so much, Stuart, and thank you so much, Lawrence, for being here. Today's conversation takes place within Lawrence's new exhibition, Earwitness Theatre, comprising two installations, Saidanya, The Missing 19 Decibels, which has been commissioned by Saja Biennial Foundation 2017, and a new body of work, Earwitness Inventory, in which we are sitting amongst today. This exhibition develops Lawrence's inquiry into the political effects of listening, building on audio analysis that he has made for humanitarian organisations such as Amnesty International. Lawrence has also produced a new performance work, After SFX, which he presented at Tate Modern last night, which was brilliant. The sounds, voices and texts included in this performance derive from objects included in Earwitness Inventory. He is also showing an expanded video work, Walled Unwalled, which is presented at Tate Tanks until this Sunday. This body of work explores what can emerge from audio-focused investigations, examining on the role of artifice, illusion and creative labour in the construction of evidence, and addresses the complexities of language and memory, where sounds become remembered as images, where objects have unexpected echoes, and where silence becomes an entire language. Earwitness Theatre is commissioned and produced by Chisenhale Gallery in partnership with Witte de With Center of Contemporary Art Rotterdam, Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis, and Institute of Modern Art Brisbane, and will be represented throughout 2019 on a global tour. Thank you to all the partners for contributing to making this new work possible. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Lawrence for making such a complex and brilliant exhibition, and for all your care and commitment. It's been so great working with you, so thank you. I'd also like to thank all of our friends and Chisenhale friends and patrons who are crucial to the work that we do here at Chisenhale, so thank you for that as well. Thank you also to Lawrence's lead exhibition supporters, lead supporters Shane Ackroyd and the London Community Foundation and Cocaine Grants for the Arts. Lawrence's exhibition was also supported by the Henry Moore Foundation and Muriel and Fedi Salem Cranford Collection, with additional support from Mark's Hicks and Hicks Restaurant and the Lawrence Abu Hamdan Supporters Circle. We would also like to thank Maureen Paley London and also to the Arts Council England for your continued support. Lawrence's exhibition concludes our 2018 commissions programme, which has included major new commissions by artists Banu Sinatoglu, Paul Maheki and Lydia Arachman. So before I hand over to Lawrence and Stuart, I'd like to offer bios by way of introduction. So Stuart Comer is the Chief Curator of Media and Performance Art at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. He was co-curator of the 2014 Whitney Biennial and has previously served as the first curator of film at Tate Modern, London. He has previously held positions at the Institute of Visual Arts in Cambridge and the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. He was co-curator of the Lion Biennial of Contemporary Art in 2007. So Lawrence Abu Hamdan lives and works in Beirut. Recent exhibitions include the Hammond Museum, Los Angeles, Maureen Paley, London, and Porticus, Frankfurt. He has also participated in Sharjah Biennial 13, Strange Attractor Ballroom Marfa, Texas, the 9th Liverpool Biennial, British Art Show 8 Hayward Gallery, London and touring, and Surround Audience, New Museum Triennial, New York. This year, Lawrence has also been the recipient of the Abraj Prize, Group Prize, and the Balwa Art Prize. So Lawrence and Stuart will talk for around 45 minutes, and there is time for questions. We are recording this event, so it'd be great before you ask your questions if you have a microphone. And over to you. Thank you very much again.
Good morning. Thank you so much to everybody here at the Chisenhale, to Polly, for the invitation to be here. Lawrence is an artist whose work I've been following for a couple of years, and as always, the Chisenhale seems to have impeccable timing about hitting an artist right as their work really crystallizes into an important project. And I think I often, as somebody who deals primarily with time-based media, try to refuse the term visual arts because priority should not always be put on the visual and cultural practices. And I think Lawrence's work, among many achievements, has really made us think much more rigorously about the role that sound plays. And I don't want to position it as sound art, it's more complex than that. But as the conversation goes on, I hope we can start to both look at what this work is doing politically, but also how it connects to some deeper histories. And on that note, I wanted to just maybe begin with something that struck me the moment I walked into this exhibition, which was something I had not expected, but its relationship to Fluxus and George Brecht in particular. And Brecht had said at a moment in the kind of late 50s, early 60s, when he and John Cage were both really, I think, really claiming some incredibly new ground. And whereas Cage was at that moment still using scores to determine his music, Brecht was already listening to the real world and moving beyond this idea of a score. And he said at the time something along the lines of, no matter what you do, you're always hearing something. And at that moment, he did an exhibition at the Rubin Gallery in downtown New York, which was a real crucible for many things in the happenings movement, in dance, in music. And he would do these exhibitions of objects, but he really was insistent that he liked the blurriness between the fact that they were neither simply objects, nor were they simply a performance. And he wanted these objects to really convey not only a visual or a physical presence, but a tactile sense that these could be activated, they didn't have to be, but that there was a sort of broader ripple effect that they could have in the space of the gallery. And so on that note, Lawrence, as you conceive this exhibition, I'd be really interested to hear how you conceive of it sort of as a sculptural installation, but with an implication that these can have a more activated connection to the sound work you've been doing.
Yeah, so it's a story that began in kind of like 2013. I will tell it in a minute, but essentially, exactly as you say, these are not sculptures, they are kind of like instruments, but instruments that are designed to be activated by sort of like also just seeing them, their relationship to the text, and by me on occasion to actually use them for a purpose, which was basically, should I just kind of like tell a bit the story of like how this whole thing came about? Maybe that would give some insight. So in 2013, I was in Sweden on a Jaspis residency, and I had met with two people that sort of like sparked something, and one of them was this forensic phonetician called Anders Eriksson, who works mostly on kind of like voice identification, speaker profiling, and actually all the work I've done since 2010 has been to find exactly people like Anders Eriksson and to interview them. And at the time, his student Lisa Oman had just finished this big investigation into earwitness testimony. So basically realizing that the veracity of eyewitness claims and the means by which sort of perception, memory of events perceived by the eye, have been documented, tested in kind of scientific processes has been extensive, whereas actual earwitness testimony has never really been explored. And that's strange because actually the majority of cases, and we just need to think about the most high-profile cases of the recent past, have all hinged on earwitness testimony. So that's why you would see like bits in the text of OJ, of Pistorius, of Trayvon Martin, of Freddie Gray, of Michael Brown. In fact, all of the kind of like recent racist murders in the US. So I had like this in my mind of them doing this kind of work. And then I went sort of like the next day to the radio theatre in Sweden, in Stockholm. And I saw this incredible environment that looked a little bit like what I've set up here. So like a series of strange objects in which nothing really looks the way it sounds, nor sounds the way it looks. Your relationship to them is neither visual nor sonic. It sort of sits in between those things. There are instruments like doors, which you could create the sound of many different doors. Strange objects like leather wallets that are, of course, used to create the sound of people walking. So things that are used entirely for other purposes. The steps leading up to the mezzanine was divided into 3 separate surfaces. I was kind of really inspired by the idea of using this space, not as a space of sonic illusion, but actually as a place in which you could use it as some form of lab for the soliciting of acoustic testimony, of acoustic experience, of ear witness events. So thinking about those 2 things together. And at the time, one of the biggest cases around was the still as yet unidentified CIA black sites that were, of course, all over Europe, that the US were using for kind of rendition and torture of Muslims mostly. And essentially, no one knew exactly where they were. But one ear witness testimony, because of course those people are hooded when they're brought to those black sites, right? So they don't really see anything, they don't know where they are, they just get like sort of fragments of acoustic information. Maybe it's an accent from a guard, maybe it's a footstep, maybe it's something ambient from outside. And one person managed to identify exactly where they were in the black site in Bucharest by the fact that they'd heard this omnidirectional sound of rail traffic all the time. And so Reprieve, the organization who were working on this at the time, used that testimony to actually locate that warehouse and where it was. And so these kind of 3 things kind of like happening in that moment start to really make me think about how you could use Foley and sonic illusion and the kind of work of Foley artists as a way to actually activate other forms of testimony, to unlock kinds of memories which are buried in unusual and sort of and ways which are sort of in excess of language, essentially. Sound is very difficult to speak about once we've experienced it. So I was fascinated by those things. Then in 2014, the US Senate report is released, which actually more or less identified where all those sites were. And so this project that we were going to use for the Swedish radio was shelved. And then kind of like fast forward 2 years later, I was with Eyal Weitzman, Forensic Architecture, and he knew about the project that was shelved, and he said, like, we've got basically a case. Forensic Architecture is an investigative agency based out of Goldsmiths.
Nominees for the Turner Prize.
Nominees for the Turner Prize, yeah. They had this case in Syria based on previous work they'd done with Amnesty. They were approached to investigate this prison, Saidnaya, which we knew very little about at the time. This was in January 2016. There were the first kind of like testimonies were coming out of this. And so Eyal said, well, why don't, because very similar to the US black sites, people who went there never knew where they were going. Later they knew where they were, and it wasn't a question of locating the prison because we know exactly where it is. But it was the idea that they had never left their cell for the whole time of their incarceration. They were blindfolded when they come in and out. So actually their entire experience of this place was through sort of little glimpses they had through the corners of their eyes as they'd covered them, just looking at their cell but hearing sounds leak from outside. And so the idea was then to produce dedicated ear witness interviews to actually unlock information about what was happening inside that prison. And that was an invitation that began in January 2016 by Amnesty International. We were doing the interviews in Turkey in April 2016, and August 2016 they released their report. And in those interviews, a lot of the information that I was working with them on and what we managed to uncover through the ear witness stuff, some of it was very useful for Amnesty. So for example, and you would see a passage in the text, all the descriptions of the sounds of the doors that one guy, Salam, described meant that based on the fact that he could identify which door was being opened in his wing, you could start to estimate how many people were being held inside. So these kind of like important information. But then other information started to emerge in those testimonies that were kind of inadmissible to the language of human rights and advocacy. There were like stranger moments that start to emerge when certain sounds were played, certain triggers happened that led to unexpected relations and associations between objects, between the ways in which things were encoded into memories and the ways in which they actually physically were, which is very difficult to speak about and to give a voice to in the context of a kind of human rights investigation. Because there's things like whispers as evidence of some kind of violence, of some kind of mass murder. There are things like the distortion in memory of a sound of a door sounding like bread dropping to the ground. Conflations between different things and the sound of food that start to speak about the way that hunger distort their senses. So it basically meant that there was this whole set of material that needed some sort of like space in which to become articulated, because there was no forum for that. And of course, the way art sort of comes to its truths, and I believe art is a mode of truth production, is really very much kind of embedded in sort of thinking through abstraction, in the absences as much as the presence, in the sort of infrastructural elements of, like, you know, every video artist knows that the cable of electricity leading to the video is just as important as the video, right? So like these kind of ways of thinking sort of like as in its totality lead you to the space of art to be able to articulate those other aspects.
Something that's interesting, I mean, you know, within the last 20-odd years, I mean, people have frequently written about the so-called documentary turn, or the ways in which visual, again, artists were turning to documentary film strategies, or other ways of bringing an idea of capturing the so-called truth into the space of art. And now in our era of alternative facts, when truth feels, you know, more at risk than ever before, you know, what kinds of strategies could we use to complicate that idea? But before we get on to, you know, this idea of fact or documentary within an artistic practice, I'd like to go back to forensic architecture for a moment and to think about Eyal Weizman many years ago was doing some really interesting research on the Israeli army's activities, and I think it gets to this idea of surveillance, or what one captures, and then the weird play between visibility and invisibility. So one of the things that he was researching at the time, this is roughly a decade ago, was the fact that the Israeli army, to avoid being surveyed from aerial planes, aerial surveillance, was to burrow through the walls of domestic homes. So they would effectively create this network, you know, under the roofs of the houses, so they could never be seen. And this idea of, you know, literally drilling through a wall, and somehow this idea of, you know, establishing a network within that connects in some ways, I think, to the idea of this kind of bleed that occurs through walls in your work. And then for those of you who haven't seen the installation at Tate Modern, Walled on Walled, you know, you do have this sense, I think, of kind of frames within frames. And again, just as spatially or architecturally, you are, as you say in the video, like dissolving walls through sound, but you are also dissolving that line between fact and fiction, and the fact that what is effectively a recording studio, which could suggest entertainment as much as it does a more forensic project, you know, you're never quite sure, as with these objects, you know, is this a staged situation, or is this a fact? Is this something that is somehow recording, you know, evidence? So maybe it would be interesting to hear a little bit about the play between that project and this project too, and how you think about architecture in your work in general, and this idea, again, of walls no longer being containers for something, but being maybe a little bit more volatile.
Being media, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, like, to come back also to your first point, so just because I realized I didn't complete it, but this collection of objects is extremely specific and is derived from it's basically me trying to produce my own sound effects library, based not on films that, you know, so say, for example, how sound effects libraries are usually made is like, okay, now you're doing a film about robots, so then in some box in a sound effects studio, you have lots of little things, right? So, and then they stay there in that box. You might use them again for some other film, right? Totally else. So the way that films accumulate their sound effects is by each sort of subject matter, right? So like you're medieval, then you're like in the future, and then whatever. You create this sort of body of objects. And here it's actually about going back and deep into earwitness testimony, looking at earwitness cases from all over the world, seeing how the ways in which people describe what they heard, which is invariably to do and with objects. And this comes back to the thing of language that I was speaking about before. Because it's so hard to give language to sound, objects are imbued with a certain kind of they're almost placeholders for memories, right? So that means that they're also the ways in which these memories can be retrieved, even if they're not accurate or factual, right? So even if someone says, it didn't sound like a punch, it sounded like an egg cracking, right? It means that in some weird way, and you hear the more they say it in court, they say the word egg 5 times, you start realizing that the egg is actually totally convolved with the event, the violent event, that they've actually remembered somehow the egg into the event. And so I'm kind of like interested also in the way of sort of like looking at these things, both as mnemonic devices, but also as their sound, but sometimes their sound doesn't sound anything like what they even think it is. It's just that there's this sort of strange feedback loop where when a punch happens, they negate the sound of what a punch sounds like because it doesn't sound like what a punch sounds like in film. But then they replace it with alternate imaginary sound effects of their own devising. So
we were saying yesterday, the Gestalt image of the duck rabbit.
Right.
It's literally, it's 2 and 1 at the same time.
Exactly. And so that's why I felt compelled to sort of collect these objects that are very specifically related to cases in which, and the language in which witnesses used to describe certain events. So like so one punch in Oregon is described as both a watermelon smashing, an egg cracking, and a cinder block dropping to the ground, right? And each of those testimonies first is preceded by the fact it didn't sound like a punch, right? So what does that mean? That means that there's a conflation, and this gets to your kind of like fiction fact point. There's a total conflation between sort of like the way we hear the world through cinema, and particularly violent events, because Foley is incredibly violent as a practice. Like sound effects is a sort of space of exception where things are beaten, torn apart, smashed. Lots of horrible things are done to objects in those rooms. And sorry, I got kind of on that object, like feeling bad for the object staying there. What I mean to say is that any process by which we need to retrieve memories has to be totally an entangled process between cinematic theatrics and scientific reenactment. And that's, for me, what I think is the only way to sort of unlock these memories. And that's why you encounter a space like this, and it stands in for sort of real event, right? So exactly, it's not about like blurring the lines where you don't know what is fact and fiction. It's actually using fiction in the mode of truth production, right? It's not trying to blur those lines.
Maybe this is a good point to mention something else that I think connects you to George Brecht, which is the fact that he was actually a chemist and was hired by a number of major corporations from Johnson & Johnson on, Pfizer, et cetera. And you are acting not only as an artist, but also as an ear witness and advising Amnesty International and other organizations. So maybe you could just go in, maybe how you create distinctions between those two ways of working, even if they're directly connected.
Yeah, so on the one hand, I'm a student of Eyal Weizmann, so I can just say that straight up, that part of it comes directly from forensic architecture. I was there when we were beginning the center. There was like 1 paid employee. Now there's like 35 somethings. Maybe some of you here are from forensic architecture. So it's an incredible project that's grown over 10 years. But what I want to say is that logic of thinking actually challenge the role of the expert, because it's not about saying that you have the expertise to do these things as an architect, as an artist, as a videographer, but actually that these are now tools that are available to all of us. So it's actually as amateurs rather than as experts. So on the one hand, I have to kind of like premise that and say that I'm not really an expert as such, more than anybody who's kind of like worked closely with music and sound and who has a kind of aesthetic sonic practice. I'm not doing anything that is necessarily more advanced than anybody who has DJ software or or sound equipment. But it's about sort of a kind of way of thinking sound, thinking, listening. What I wanted to say is also that yes, this idea of being a kind of chemist. And we were talking about this yesterday in the sense that at one point those distinctions were not necessary when there was still a relationship between sort of like art and truth, right? So, I mean, I'm thinking about like the Nahda, the Arabic Renaissance, the Enlightenment, where, you know, that's where alchemy began. Actually, the first kind of like chemists were poets. So I find those times to be kind of like interesting because there's a sort of Venn diagram you could make in the pursuit of some kind of like aesthetic sort of in the pursuit, in my case, let's say, of a kind of like collective acoustic unconscious, or like a sort of way of sort of tapping into the way we think and translate sound, then again, you need sort of processes that are both at the threshold of kind of like art, journalism, science, in order to kind of activate those things.
Just to maybe one last time bring it back to Eyal, another kind of major point in some of his earliest writings was he talked a lot about the politics of verticality. So that, you know, if one looks at a map, one normally thinks of it in 2 dimensions. And he did a lot of research into the Israeli army's use of stereoscopic photography, which would then allow those 2 dimensions to expand. And you suddenly saw layers that had not previously been visible. And within those layers, many political situations became more clear. I think in Walled Unwalled, you literally see that too, in terms of the layers and the walls presented, and, you know, how you start to read other details that might not immediately be legible. So to do that kind of a reading on these objects, for instance, and how that would allow you to explore more deeply your research into Sadnaya, I think is an interesting question for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think what interests me most about sound is leakage. It's like inability to be contained, and particularly thinking that about its relationship to evidence, right? And evidence demands that things are isolated. Objects become individuated. We can find a fingerprint here, smoking gun there, whatever it is. But when you speak about sound, and this is one of the biggest problems actually when sound enters the law court, is that it's totally impossible to entangle from its surroundings, its acoustics, its the way it kind of like landed on whoever it landed on, where it went, and the architecture as a sort of means by which it was mediated. So what's fascinating about the Sadnaya investigation and what they taught me so well is that they basically fought sensory deprivation through listening, right? And that's no mean feat, because sound in that context was both designed to hurt them, and it was their only way of actually surviving to give testimony about what they heard there. So it had this kind of double bind, right? It was designed in the prison to actually be a kind of weapon of torture, as so much torture is in the kind of acoustic realm. But at the same time, unbeknownst to those who were torturing them and keeping them there, they could use certain kinds of artifact to actually manifest some understanding and sort of retrieve some kind of knowledge about a place in which, by design, all except its violence was hidden from them, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that was an incredible sort of lesson in listening, in a way. And what was really fascinating in the context of meeting those people is that what you realize is sound was of a different order. It wasn't in the kind of context of PTSD where a random sound would spark a trauma, right? This is how PTSD, like a loud bang and you're back in the war zone or wherever you've been. Here, because they were so attuned to sound, and because they had to be so kind of like forensic in the way they listen, it's extremely specific the way their relation to sound is. So it has a kind of layer of detail that means that the process was not triggering any trauma as I feared it would when Amnesty first asked me to do this thing. It actually was this kind of cathartic process by which they could use a medium to kind of like reconstruct and objectify a place, right? Mm. So this kind of like pulling it out of the mind's ear had this totally other effect than what you might imagine by like triggering sounds and playing things. And it really wasn't like that anyway. We played, let's say, footsteps. We played the sounds of doors to get the doors right. We played tones, as you would hear in the sound piece inside, and clicks and echoes. So it was really kind of like a very sort of specific practice that was nothing to do with necessarily like creating triggers or whatever, but actually to sort of like activate and give form to something that we didn't necessarily have the language to speak about otherwise. So it's actually kind of like the process of creating a language in that interview. And that's why it was necessary to have an artist in there. And I realized, this doesn't have anything to do with the politics of verticality, but why I deviated was really this question of leakage. That question of leakage start to extend throughout the process. So it meant that if you were trying to isolate something, you would always hit a dead end, right? If you were trying to say, is this the door sound? Is this exactly what you heard? You would always leak onto the next thing. And if you weren't attuned to the leakages, then you missed all the most important information that they were giving you about that prison. So, for example, again, the distortion. I was playing Sam the sound of the door, and he says, like, no, the door is louder, the door is louder. We keep playing, it's like louder. And then we play one, and it's like huge, it's like 4-second reverb, and it's like sound like some crazy film from the 50s. And he goes like, that's there, but it wasn't the door, that was the bread being dropped to the ground outside my cell. So of course, you then kind of like understand that you're not talking about the laws of physics. You're not talking about the door anymore. You're talking about hunger. You're talking about the way in which hunger can like bleed into the acoustic cortex and can like change and transform the way in which you would experience that place. And through that, you get a tiny window into what it means to be hungry. More than you would if someone tells you, I didn't eat for 7 days or I had just a piece of bread. Suddenly you can like hear it. And it's exactly in that kind of leakage between kind of like the architecture, the sort of environment, the hunger, the states in which they were held, the idea that they were, the hyper alertness in which they were listening, mean that was where all the kind of like productive information was happening. And that's unfortunately not in the logics of evidence, which seek to kind of like isolate and close. And because of that experience, in a way, I make something like Walled on Walled, where in which I'm trying to show that the sort of violence of a wall and a border is not its shutness. It's not its presence as a solid object. It's actually as a filter, as a process of filtration, as a medium in itself. And that's the same whether you were talking about the UK border, right? The UK border is so violent and is so bloodthirsty because it costs the lives of so many people. Not because it's shut. If it was shut, it would be way better. The fact is that, they say like, oh, can you prove you have £10,000 in your bank account? That document, which demand immigrants to prove they have £10,000 in their bank account, is directly equivalent to maybe, you can't account for it, but so many deaths in the Mediterranean, right? Mm. So we have to understand that the process by which the border kills is not through its harsh, not through the idea of visibility of what a limit does, right? We don't see past it, but actually more in acoustic terms, in the ways in which things filter through it, and sounds that stop going through it, and what's passable and what's not. So that's for me the most important lesson I learned from this thing, and also in terms of thinking acoustically, it sort of like shake me out of that, right? It's like, stop being a sound essentialist, right? Like, start thinking about, if you're interested in sound, you're actually interested in leakage. You're not interested in the medium of sound. You're interested in the ways things kind of leak between one another, and the ways things are uncontainable or containable in stranger, unusual ways.
Which anyone who has installed a video installation knows something about.
Exactly.
Yes. I just wanted to go back quickly too, because you made me recall, there's this great Haroon Farouki project called Immersion, where he interviews soldiers who had post-traumatic stress disorder from seeing their best friend blow up, in Iraq. And so they're given virtual reality helmets, and they effectively relive their trauma through a virtual reality animation. And then suddenly, I mean, it's all very disturbing. And then suddenly you realize all of this is fake. He's actually filming a classroom where this is being staged to train military personnel and potentially how they might address people who have PTSD. So again, it gets to this strange fine line between evidence and, documentary strategies or reconstruction in theater. And so just the way in which, again, the duck rabbit and its slipperiness between one form and another. It is, I think, kind of one of the major hinges in your work and how it functions. But maybe I'd like to put this project into the context of some of your earlier work too. The audio archive, how did you really begin this active process of researching sound? This idea of testimony in particular, and literally going from the courtroom into the prison itself, I think is an interesting trajectory.
Yeah, so, well, 2008, I'm interested in sound. I have like a music background. I was really interested in sort of sound and architecture in the ways that many people before me have been. Super inspired by people like Alvin Lucier, also for other reasons which we can talk about in a minute. But it's really then, when I start, in 2010, when I meet, when I start thinking about the sort of politics of sound, that you start realizing that a lot of the sort of literature, artistic work on sound is interested in ephemerality, in the idea that things last briefly, in the poetics of sound, in the idea that you can't shut your ears, but you can shut your eyes. Like, these are the kind of cliches now of like audio culture. And what bothered me about that is that anyone who's been in a courtroom sees very precisely that it's possible to shut your ears, right? That there's so much that just goes unheard. And it's, in fact, kind of mechanisms by which things are heard and unheard and all the rest of it. So it kind of like made me feel that this sort of like more transhistorical, more like phenomenological approach to sound lacked what was actually kind of going on politically, and the ways in which kind of people were becoming audible politically had nothing to do with the way the sort of philosophical and artistic kind of like people dealing with sound were really kind of attempting to do. And so in 2010 I meet this guy called Dr. Peter French, who is a forensic listener. He was one of the first wave of people who in the mid-80s began setting up independent audio labs to do this kind of work, forensic audio work, basically analyzing voices, analyzing sounds. And the trajectory is super interesting. And meeting him was, of course, like, I hate this word, but there's some kind of like problems in what he does, right? Like he does basically ethnic profiling of voices. But at the same time, it's totally inspiring because it's this markedly material approach to sound, right? He would listen to one voice from a police interview tape for like 3 days at a time, one little syllable, right? So in a way, it kind of like struck me as something as avant-garde as what like Terry Riley was doing, right, in the 70s, that it had this same kind of intensity of kind of like listening, these strategies which perhaps leak from the avant-garde into like ways of kind of understanding the world. And it totally inspired me to start thinking about sound as material, as political, as not transhistorical, but deeply rooted in specific kind of instances and moments and ways of perceiving it.
I mean, yesterday we were talking, I am very interested in how, as I mentioned in my introduction, how this work connects to a deeper history of the avant-garde. And we were talking a little bit yesterday about, Hans Richter and his G Journal, and many members of the Die Stijl group, for instance, used to talk a lot about the translation between forms. So how a musical score, a film script, an architectural space, a drawing, all somehow connected and became effectively the same thing, or that they could translate into one another sort of seamlessly. But I'm now actually thinking a little bit about synesthesia and some of the ideas Kandinsky and others were coming up with. And of course, that was connecting to a more conventional notion of music. And what you're doing is emphatically not music, but that does go through Cage and Brecht and people who question the limits of sound and the limits of music. So I'm just curious how you would think about positioning your work within a history of synesthetic practices.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I I don't know that. I mean, it hasn't really dealt with it so much until I start really going into this actual Earwitness inventory. I think this is the first time, not necessarily synesthetic, but you sort of like see the sort of ways in which artifacts and sounds and memory sort of like coalesce in these strange ways, and cinema, you know.
I mean, it also asks the question, who is allowed to have sight? If
Right.
you're a prisoner in the sight,
Yeah.
you know, you can't see.
Right,
So then
exactly.
it privileges one sense over the other. Right?
Yeah, and well, I was also thinking, you know, for me, I like to also draw parallels between this sort of mid-'80s wave of forensic listeners and the kind of like audio avant-garde, John Cage and those people, because I find it much more useful in thinking about surveillance, to think about those practices of listening that emerged in the 60s and 70s than, let's say, George Orwell's 1984, right? So like, actually Cage is the diagram, like 433 is the diagram for mass surveillance. It's not Orwell or Foucault. It's actually like the idea that what Cage proposes is that, you know, like you are as a collective, you're basically metadata, right? So like you cough here, you rustle in your seat there, you whatever there, and that kind of like create a strange image of exactly what's happened, moving away from the idea of the performer in the center of the space, right? So like the old idea of surveillance, like we're watching you, to actually like we're listening to this sort of collective sound and where like little pieces of things happen and where they go. So like kind of moving from foreground to background, actually.
But then this is why the Lucier, I think, is really pertinent, because it's literally the relationship between him, the lone performer in the center of the room, and the walls.
Exactly.
And then suddenly the resonant frequency of what he's saying and how that ricochets off the walls is the piece, because then it begins to distort and turn into feedback.
Exactly.
And that feedback is the product of the relationship between the body and the space.
Yeah.
So to me, maybe he is the key link in some ways.
Definitely, and then again, like what it has to do on an individual level for him. I mean, like, so he has a stutter, and then the space kind of like smooths out the stutter, right? So as his voice plays in the room and keeps getting played back, eventually it just becomes this kind of like smoothed out sound from a guy who's like kind of nervously stutters his first sentence. And I think it's exactly that, which is, again, the kind of interesting parallel, because I think we think in this very kind of individual terms, right? Mm-hmm. And I think those are probably the least useful ways of contesting some of the politics that are happening. Because, for example, if you've ever been interviewed by the police or border agents, which happened to me every time I go to the US, because they think I'm like white convert, right? So I think like went all Cat Stevens. In fact, I'm just born like this, but it's fine. So they take me to secondary, and in secondary it's a very kind of like sort of theatrics of intimidation. But the very first thing you learn is that it has nothing to do with you, right? Like interview process wants nothing to do with your personal account of events. It's all about like who you know, who's the last person you called, where did this happen? So actually they just start producing you as, again, like a kind of collective of information that link to other people. And again, they're interested in leakage. They're not interested in subject in some strange way. Or the way they arrive at their subjects is not through what we imagine in terms of our identity. Like, no, I'm this, I have the right to be British even if I was born somewhere else. You know, all this stuff that we think about as like our personal identities doesn't matter to them. So in the means of contesting those narratives and the way that we're being surveilled, I think it's important to look at people like Lucier, who actually kind of like undoes himself in the room, right? To turn into room itself, to think about the ways in which we can actually kind of like remobilize some way of conceptually approaching some of the more kind of like insidious things that we're facing politically, racism, you know, all manner of things, yeah.
So we have probably time for one last question from me before we open it up to all of you, and I'm going to be greedy and try to smash two questions into one.
Yeah.
We haven't really discussed, the context a lot of people would like to place you in, which is the Lebanese context of artists like Walid Krar and Akram Zaatari and Rabia Mouret, who were also in their own manner looking at this divide between fact and fiction and finding playful ways to get around it. But to my mind, that work was ultimately about the problem of the archive in the Arab world and the fact that so much of it had been demolished by warfare and ways in which they might reconstruct it imaginatively or speculatively as a political act. So there's a slightly different kind of role play going on. And then, just to fast forward, to connect past, present, and future, I'm just thinking not only about the Kavanaugh trial in the States of the last week or so, and just watching the legal process and this, again, act of witnessing and lie detector tests and the kinds of devices you use in your work. But also this notion that I'm hearing more about that, anything can now be reconstructed through computer technology. So any fragment of either of our voices could be used to construct a whole phrase, presumably spoken by us, that we never did speak, and then that can now be generated. And you can imagine how that will mushroom into a major disaster on so many levels. And so Trump can easily then say, anything is an alternative fact. That's not me, that's not real. And so what artists have been doing for a while in scrambling fact and fiction can now be used to rather sinister ends by politicians. So how can you critically position your own political act in your work to maybe not counter that, but at least question it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. So, in a way, and this is like a broad statement, but if you think about the sort of ways in which, so I was in Rabia Amrou invited me to be part of a kind of like series of performances he did. And actually we had a kind of like argument about this very thing. And I said, because he was sort of on this line about how he was interested in Ahmed Beydoun, this historian, because he's kind of like contra history, and he was like using all these kind of like Goddardian references, and it was around the time that Trump had shown the image of his inauguration and said like, no, there was more people, but they were just outside the frame of the image, right? There was more people than Obama. You just don't. The media choose to frame the thing, and actually, that's exactly the logics of Godard, like the frame of the shot, all kind of like post-structuralist work was to always like undo truth, and actually, in the end, unexpectedly, it's become a gift to the right. And I think what we're trying to do is something slightly different, mobilizing some of those same strategies that they said about. Accepting that, okay, yeah, and there's another layer to this, right, which you could read, which is also that the reason why Walid and Akram and Rabia and Lina Majdalani and those artists were working at that time in that way is also something that now the West is coming to terms with, right? So like, we who've been colonized have always lived in a post-truth era. Mm-hmm. You maybe just came to that, but that's like always been the case for the context in which I certainly grew up and many people grow up. And so that's interesting that also become a precursor to that emerging from post-colonial discourse that's where they were coming from at the time. And now there's an echo of that again through this other resurgence of kind of like media and technology. And so there's that element of it, and I told him, so in what way is what you're proposing different to the ways in which this logic has been used by the most powerful people in the world? And it was kind of like went back and forth, whatever, but I think it's an interesting point of discussion because exactly what I'm trying to do is not to undo truth. I'm actually trying to produce it, but in other terms, not to be restricted by the ways in which and this is again why I find art so powerful now, especially because, again, for me, art is not about fiction or I think why I was drawn to art in the first place is they allow you to see something, it is kind of romantic, but allow you to understand some truth about the world, right? In a way, it's kind of like the first idea of painting, that actually a painting could actually be more real interpretation of a human, whatever subject, than a photograph or being with the person, right? And so I think there's something sort of in that romantic use of art and thinking through art that actually could be used towards mobilizing truth rather than to undo it, to always say there is no truth, and look here, the more we look, the less we see, the less we understand. I think there's ways in which you can actually come to truths which other forums do not accept. So that's, for example, why this piece in the sound room focused on the whispers, because for me, the whisper was a way to access exactly what was happening inside that prison. But what we're trying to do is measure silence. And so, again, we're in the realm of measuring something that is non-represented, is non-representable in some respects. And so you're immediately pushed into the realm of like borrowing from abstraction and these kind of processes more than you are ways of usually accumulating evidence. Because anyway, you're speaking to people who are at the threshold of perception, right? They didn't see. So to use the logics of evidence for people who have sensory deprivation doesn't make sense. You need to sort of use artistic tools which are more comfortable with the idea of the non-image, the non-representable, the non-thing, or the thing that can stand for other things. And these, again, kinds of leakages between strategies that actually allow you to unlock and propose truth claims about what's happening in that prison or about certain experiences that people went through. More than perhaps, or in a different way than perhaps amnesty could,
And lastly, I would only just say too, I think the play between abstraction and figuration has often been an artificial binary, and artists like you have, again, dissolved that. But if you think about, going back to the Renaissance, when there were debates between painting, sculpture, poetry, as to which was the better, art form and the more important. And then by the time you get to Cubism, you're expressing multiple dimensions within two dimensions. But, I do think in your work, there's this play not only between pattern recognition or somehow, abstracting a very complex political situation into a graphic, into a sound, into an object like the one you see here. But there is this play between multiple dimensions, multiple spaces, bodies and images that I think really does draw on artistic practice over many centuries, but not at the expense of offering a political critique on the here and now and the real world.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Wow.
on that note, sure there are some questions right here in front.
Nothing too hard, please.
Yeah, it'd be great if you could talk a bit more about your thinking process of turning this piece into the audible version at Tate.
Yeah.
Maybe including the two decisions. One was last night mixing your own physical speaking, the list, and the playback of the list. And the other is minor, but the decision of the use of multi-layered screen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The recordings you heard last night in Tate were made here. They're actually these objects recorded. If there weren't so many people, I could actually demonstrate some of them. For
Wagon
example,
wheel.
the last thing you heard was this. So we made all the recordings here, and again, that's in the pursuit of making a sound effects library, right? So producing this kind of archive of ways in which witnesses describe and specific sounds that have been really important to legal cases. And so the idea is then that you don't hear these sounds in this space, but that you're forced to kind of like embody a kind of large, silent audio work, which allow you to, or propose to you to actually kind of like imagine and encode these sounds into your mind, right, from seeing them. And then in the Tate, you just hear them and you don't see them, right? So that distinction was important for me in terms of the performance last night. So performance last night was basically this text set to the sounds and the recordings we made in this space. And these objects were actually placed exactly as they're recorded. So when we record that tray rack, when we dropped it to the ground, that's where it landed. And And the tray rack is related to the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and Alistair Cook's description of it, saying it didn't at all sound like gunshots, but like a rack of trays dropping to the ground. And, you know, the sort of like conspiracy theorist in me wants to say, that's because there was multiple gunshots, right? But another thing is also just the sort of, is that kind of like moment where like someone is shot and then it happens in seconds and you don't process it, and you heard this tray rack and you'd already heard the sound as something else, and then you realize someone's shot on the ground, right? So that kind of like moment is encapsulated in the idea of hearing this thing as a tray rack. That kind of strange moment is captured in that description, in hearing his testimony, rather than only kind of like seeing it and knowing what happened, right? So you can kind of like archive these moments through these objects, and that's what I'm kind of fascinated by, and why there's this kind of like relation between the two, and why it's important to separate sort of like hearing and listening to them, so that when you're hearing them in Tate, you're also analytically at work trying to sort of like hear the sounds, and they start to become indistinguishable, right? Like a popcorn maker sound like celery, or like a door sound like a gun, or like, you know, do you see what I mean? Like that's at work also, that sort of idea. And so both are actually processes of encoding into the audience new kinds of acoustic memories. And I think, so in that sense, the works, both visually and acoustically in their separate parts, try to be generative of acoustic memory more than they are of just illustrative of them, right? Someone could also press that button on the car door. Yeah, just to show you, the window works. It's all working. It's not theatre. It's not. We can do an ear-witness investigation now if anyone needs to.
I think this idea of the sensory deprivation, like, is really, really fascinating, and it does tie you into the synesthesia thing, and also to a certain point maybe aspects of schizophrenia, so, or auditory hallucination almost. How did you deal with that whilst you were dealing with the testimonies, and was it something that was taken advantage of in terms of cross-examination of the witnesses?
Yeah, so there's been no legal foundation for Saidnaya, right? It's just advocacy work. It's so and again, the ways in which I interviewed them and ways I was invited to interview them already compromise a little bit the legal process, because we're playing sounds, did it sound like this, did it sound like that? You know, it was more collaborative than it was them given the sort of objective distance to speak about it. But I think it's simply about being attuned to those moments and trying to listen out for them and for what they mean, and not to, of course, overinterpret them, but because you're dealing with so little, things like whispers, and because there's no material trace of that place, you're already kind of attuned to these sort of ways of distortions, and none of them some of them were traumatized. They're not schizophrenic or whatever, so it wasn't necessarily those questions I was directly dealing with, but it was just trying to listen to them, not only to activate multiple ways of listening at once. So what I'm trying to say in that piece inside is that sometimes it was important to listen to what they said, and sometimes actually the voice itself kind of like carried a material trace of the prison, right? So like the way in which they would describe their muscles sort of readjusting to the world outside once they could speak again, right? Those things actually mean that when we have such little evidence of the place, the sort of things that they carry with them muscularly or physically, or the way they speak and the way they remember speaking and hearing, become these sort of strange material traces of this place, which cannot necessarily be grasped in a kind of like evidential way, but give you this sort of, for me, very lucid insight into the place and those experiences. And particularly with this piece, they really take ownership of that. Like, they're very happy with the way that was articulated, because that's something that there's no other forum for, right? And so, yeah. Should we turn off the ice cream?
Could you talk to us about what research and investigative projects you're working on now?
Now I'm on, like in 15 minutes, I'm on a paternity break for like 2 months. So there's nothing right now that I'm working on. But again, like I always work together with forensic architecture. I've worked on several cases with them, but sometimes, you know, the sound is just one little element of a huge case they're working on. And it just stays like that. And sometimes it's something like the Site 9 investigation, which changed fundamentally the way I think about the world. And then it demands a process of artistic translation to sort of like get that out of my mind and to sort of communicate that to people. So where there's broader stakes involved, sometimes I generate my own works, and sometimes I just work with them strictly, you know, to do one analysis. So, you know, so yeah. But there's been many cases, and also I'm a bit unsure right now what I can and cannot speak about. So I get a bit confused with those things. But for example, I mean, I don't know if you saw the work, which I can talk about, where in which, you know, we had to analyze the sound of a gunshot to see if it was a rubber bullet, as the Israeli Defense Force claim, or a live ammunition. And that also start to unravel in my mind a whole kind of discourse around like silence and suppression and these kinds of things, as well as the more analytical work that's necessary in just analyzing the sound and its frequencies.
Because I know this has come up, and I don't know if anybody was going to ask this question, but I mean, in terms of the ethics of the work, or bringing, you know, these kinds of sounds and recordings into the space of art, into the space of your work, Andrea Fraser, who's an artist I highly, highly respect, but I had some questions about the commission she did for the Whitney in New York, where she recorded the sounds of prisoners at Rikers Island as part of a critique about the fact that the military-industrial complex was expanding at a rate comparable to the expansion of the of museum expansions, just literally the physical expansion of the buildings across the U.S. But the space was large and left completely empty, except for the recording of the prisoners. And so you would hear like cafeteria trays being banged on tables. And I don't know, it left me feeling very uncomfortable at the end of that project. And I don't feel that discomfort in your work, and I haven't answered for myself why, but I'm just wondering, I know it's a difficult question, but I'm wondering if you could, I'm sure it has been asked before, and I'm just curious.
I mean, there is discomfort for sure, and the relations between people are never so perfect, right? And, you know, also going into doing the investigation for Amnesty, like, really a lot of weird stuff happened. So, like, the first night they told us, like, okay, if they tell you something hard, Amnesty, if they tell you something very difficult, don't react. Don't go like, don't have a strong reaction. So I was like, okay, I gotta remember that. Don't react. So I go in there, and then like I'm talking, he tell me something, I go like, And then the feedback that day was like, the hell wrong with this Haji? He's not like I tell him stuff, like does he like, is he there? Like what, you know? So, you know, then you realize that, okay, I need to just like calm down. These are just like people, and you know, you relate to them in the same way you relate to other things. And then once that happened, you could start to sort of get in a different thing. And I suppose one thing I can say in relation to what the work you just mentioned, I don't know that work, but I would never have solicited these testimonies for making artwork. I was invited by Amnesty to do this Earwitness interviews for them. Those interviews changed the way I think, and I'm trying to sort of like process that in the aftermath. So in many ways, this work is trying to sort of like, in its three parts, in the entire body of work, and I'm sorry for those people who weren't at the Tate, but in its three parts, try to sort of articulate why they fundamentally change the way I think about architecture, about the human voice, and about memory and our relationship to sort of quotidian objects and things like that. And so I think there's so much at stake, you know, and maybe this is one of the biggest problems of the work, in what they told me, which is not of direct use value to them anymore, but for a broader thinking about kind of collective acoustic unconscious and what it means to listen. Of course, we tried to do everything to make a very comprehensive account for them, that they got everything out and they said everything they want to say, so that we got it, and most of that is in the Amnesty report, except for the things that you see here, like the whispers, which there's no place for it, right? So art becomes this place which is not a place to exhibit suffering, but actually the only place in which we can think in ways which we're not allowed to think about it through the discourse of human rights. If you see what I mean. It's really about experimenting with the conditions by which testimony is heard, and the way we can actually access it, so that there are other forums other than the news and whatever that we can access and process this information. Yeah.
One last question. Anybody? Lawrence, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. And thanks again to Chisenhale, to Ellie and Polly and everybody here. Thank you so much.